That's all right. We're very happy to have Ken Knapp back at the library. He enlightens us always as to how people lived in the place we are living now. If you weren't here last April, you can hear his talk online. Just go to the library website and it's there. Or if you were there and want to refresh yourself, it's there. And our board secretary / videographer extraordinaire is taping this talk, so please watch out for the orange cord that goes to the back of the room.
And speak up.
Since we last saw Ken, he's been working on a new and very intriguing site, usually working on some site. And it's in a very unlikely place. So it has ramifications for how people may have lived long ago here. And it's now official, the Knapp archaeological gene has gone to a 5th generation. It's official because they've been doing it ever since they were little, but Colleen has graduated with a degree in archaeology.
Cool.
And it seems that Kenny Nolan can't help but finding 10-centimeter points just by walking down a road.
Wow.
And I'm sure the passion goes with the genes. So
Yes.
more exciting
Yes.
things to come.
Yeah, it is.
So, Kenny, my pleasure to introduce Ken Knapp.
Hello. Thank you all for coming. I'm glad to see there's this many people interested in the subject. It's always good. I'm not a professional archaeologist, but I've had a chance to work with a bunch of them, and you could call some of them friends actually. And I would call it more of a obsession than anything else. Something I've been obsessed with since I was a little kid. I mean, really little, but that comes with the family. But anyway, we do a good job celebrating our 300 or 400 years of history we've got up here. I mean, everybody's quite proud of it, and you know, it's a great heritage. What I wanted to talk tonight about is a little bit about the other 12,000 years of heritage that are up here that most people around here are not really that aware of or know that much about them. So I was going to give you kind of a general overview of things, and then talks about some specific sites. I have my notes here because I usually don't speak from notes, but I want to remember to say everything I wanted to say. I use the term ancient man to refer to the people that have been here for thousands of years, and basically say about 12,000 years ago, give or take. And I'm talking, in our region, I'm talking not just the Thousand Islands, but kind of to the Tug Hill, this kind of the upper St. Lawrence Valley. But yeah, I refer to ancient man as these people that have been here for, or were here for, since about 12,000 years ago almost, and basically kind of when the first European showed his face around here, which is 1608, I believe, it was Champlain. There was no longer people living up here. I mean, it was part of the hunting and fishing grounds for the Five Nations, the Onondaga and the Oneida Indians, and farther downriver would be the Mohawk. But essentially, thousands of years of people living here kind of sort of ended about the time Europeans showed up here. And so I'm trying to shed a little more light on those other people that we really don't know a lot about. Some people, I guess, know a little bit about them, I suppose. One of the neat things in archaeology is it's changing, always changing. It's like a CSI that's working on the oldest cold case you can imagine, and then just about every day or every year you find some other clue that it may change everything that you thought. And so you could write a book this thick and be right on the cash, and next year somebody could find something that could just, your book, toss it. So it's pretty neat, because it gives me a chance to talk about it every year and not quite say the same thing, maybe, hopefully. But one of the key things that I've learned is that to really understand ancient man in the Thousand Islands region, you've got to really understand what has happened to this region over the last 12,000 years. Incredible, drastic changes. It wasn't always the way we see it now, for sure. And basically, somewhere around 12,500 years ago, the ice starts retreating. And we have this massive glacial lake that the shores basically were on the Tug Hill Plateau was the shores. I know you guys are all familiar with the area. And that giant lake, which would have been, 100 or 200 feet above our head, I don't like to think about it.
Wow.
But yeah, several hundred feet above our head. We're sitting around on the bottom of the glacial lake right now. And in fact, all of our gnarly clay soil that we have around here, that's sediment from the bottom of this lake. It settled down and sat there. But it's insane the amount of change has gone on in a rapid amount of pace in the sense of geology time. You have this glacial lake. It's flowing out the Oswego River into the Mohawk Valley and into the Hudson River. That's where this lake was draining. The river was blocked by ice. But then somewhere around this 12,000 year time, that ice that was to our northeast disappeared, retreated, and the St. Lawrence River was basically born. And the glacial lake gradually started heading towards its current shores, and it all started flowing out the river. So that's when our river was actually born. And it's interesting that within a short amount of time after our river was born, the ocean wasn't in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The ocean was someplace between Wellesley Island and Ogdensburg. Because all that land was submerged beneath this ice, was all squished down. It took many, many years for it to rise back up. So in the meantime, the sea came and visited us. So for a time, the St. Lawrence was only as short as Cape Vincent to maybe Wellesley Island or Ogdensburg. And of course, this whole time, you got to think there was people living here. So just think of, we talk about climate change, but this was incredible, drastic. Strangely enough, right after this they call it the Champlain Sea episode, the area the Great Lakes entirety went into a really, really dry period. So dry that the lakes shrank. And if you have lakefront right now, you'd have been looking a mile before you seen the water.
Wow.
And here's the thing few people know is that for a period of time, not really sure, maybe 1,000 years, 2,000 years, Lake Ontario was not connected to the St. Lawrence River. The river was born, then there's no water going into it. There's good evidence that there was water in the river basin. It just wasn't coming from Lake Ontario, and it probably was drastically lower than what we got now. It may have been a series of channels that just took the water of the river's tributaries, but there was actually a separation. And then by about 7,500 years ago or so, a massive low pressure system, massive, like biblical massive, parked itself over the Great Lakes. And over the next, I'm not a professional, so I can't give exact numbers, but over the next 500, 1,000 years, this thing sat there and dumped rain. Pacific Northwest condition. It just dumped rains, and it literally recharged the Great Lakes. And so then somewhere around 7,500 years ago, Lake Ontario returned to sort of its current boundaries now, and the river started flowing again. And over the course of time, the river and the lake both went up drastically, down drastically. So there were several episodes where the river was just totally not like we know it today. The islands would have been little mountains. The shoals that are down 100 foot now would have been knobs of land sticking out of the water. But all of these events took place in a relatively short amount of time, so that by 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, we were looking at similar conditions that we have now, other than it was much warmer and wetter. And the climate gradually changed over the next 5,000 years to what we got now. Now the reason I think it's important to kind of get a picture of that in your head, because just to kind of understand how ancient man lived here and what he was doing, and then et cetera, you kind of have a good idea of what was happening with the land, because that really was telling you the story. There's basically the Native American archaeology in our area is broken into 3 time periods, essentially. And I'll just give you some rough on it and get to some other stuff. But basically, the first period was Paleo people. We all know, you ever seen the fluted points, the Clovis people, you know, caveman stuff, you know. Those were the earliest people that showed their faces around here. So, at about 8,000 or 9,000 years ago, I mean, some of these dates conflict, which you'll find in archaeology, but just bear with me. 8,000 or 9,000 years ago, on the shores of this glacial lake as it was receding, over near Fort Drum, there was actually the earliest site that I know of in the area that was checked out, and this was done by the cultural resource people at Fort Drum. And it was a site where they were building boats on the shores of this glacial lake. So you can imagine that way back then, there's people building boats on the edge of the lake. You know, maybe they're paddling above us, I don't know. But it just goes to show you that's right off the bat, the first people that came here were totally into the water, just like we are now. Their whole life, everything revolved around the water, depending on if it was real deep or way down, you know. But it kind of revolved around it, much the same way ours does now. There was a fluted point found on Fort Drum. That I think was about 800 feet sea level, and the site I was just referring to. You're not supposed to call it the boat building site, but that's what I call it. It's FDP-1208, according to the Army. But anyway, that is actually at 600 feet sea level. So that's, when the water was that deep, and you know, we're probably under 300 down here in the valley, so you can imagine how much water was above us. Of course, it's all a little variable because land was rising and stuff from the glacial rebound and etc. But basically, they found a fluted point. They found evidence of these boat building culture, and there's also been 2 fluted points that I know of that are found right in the river. One was over on a Canadian island, the Canadian Grenadier, I think it's called, I believe. And another one was found right in Cedar Point. So that shows you that the Paleo man was not only here while the lake was really deep, but he was here when our land form kind of got to where it is now. And these time periods are what you would call elastic. They overlap. So the Paleo man time period kind of overlaps with the next time period. Which Paleo, they figure, is in our area 12,500 years ago to about 8,000 or 9,000 years ago. And that starts the next time period, which is the Archaic. And that is the longest stretch of time that people inhabited our area. That went from 8,000 or 9,000 years ago to I think about 3,000 years ago. And there's, in our area, that's where you really start seeing signs of activity around here. A lot of the materials you see up here, not the ceramics, but this, in this glass, they're all archaic mostly. Very, very old. I mean, they can range pretty up there. And then, of course, the next period after that started around 3,000 years ago up until about 500 years ago, and that's the woodland period. And that's where we think the Iroquois people and so on and so forth. And basically, you can think of woodland as the people that first had ceramics, bow and arrow, corn, that kind of stuff. There was a sea change in the way people were living it. And that's kind of how people categorized it to come up with the 3 time periods. But anyway, so that's kind of giving you a general overview. And as far as specifically, the oldest site right around here, and that I've got any familiarity with, that I can identify for sure, is one called the Bishaw site, which is right at the mouth of French Creek. There's quite a lot of material in this case from there, and this was found way out right close to Wilbur Walls, if anybody's familiar with it. And we found it located in the early 90s when they plowed the field. And people in my family do weird things like, oh, there's a plowed field, let's go walk around in it. And we walk around and look for things, because people ask me a lot, how do you find it? We look. I mean, that's a lot of it right there. But anyway, we discovered through a little digging and evidence and stuff that basically most of the material we gathered from that was just picked up off the plowed field. And this one small case here is about a tenth of the material we've collected from that one particular site over 2 or 3 seasons. They plowed it every 6 or 7 years. So, and it's very interesting because on that site there's some tools that you can definitely identify as boat building tools, woodworking tools. Something like this, which, you know, looks like a kind of a skinny looking arrowhead thing. Well, it's actually a drill. And if you notice, it's bent. It looks bent. Well, anybody that's a woodworker might be familiar with a spoon drill, where essentially when you, because of the way you rotate it, it scoops out scoops of wood. And it's really neat because right off the bat, the earliest sign that we have that I'm aware of, again, in our area is these archaic people that were building boats. Again, building boats down there at French Creek. Not too different than what we do nowadays, I guess. But it's really neat because there's the Bishaw site at the mouth of French Creek. The foot of grindstone is littered with archaic materials. It's phenomenal that you can still go to a lot of the beaches and untrodden shorelines around there and still pick up stuff. I mean, there was a lot of activity on the foot of grindstone. And there was a lot of activity actually all the way around grindstone. Most of the early activity, and it may be just because of a sampling area, seems to be at the foot of grindstone. But what's neat is you have the foot of grindstone, and I'm going to move this map that nobody can probably see from where they're sitting. But here's grindstone here. Here's where the Bishaw site is at the mouth of French Creek. And then here's Chameau Bay. And all 3 of these places have a huge concentration of this early material. So it's neat because there's already a defined pathway, so to speak, a route these people were working that involved the Chameau Bay, Chameau River. Our town has 2 rivers, remember. We share it. But, and this French Creek Valley, so to speak. We call it valley around here. It's not a valley, but I mean. And it's neat because now you start seeing patterns of activity. And this particular pattern of activity, 1, 2, 3, continues right through time. The next, and really I have not myself found anything that's readily identifiable as paleo, but I am not an expert, so there could be stuff in my collection, it could be stuff in other collections that's actually paleo, nobody's recognized it. But so anyway, that's why I'm speaking closer about the archaic, because as the earliest people, because that's the one I'm familiar with. But it's just really interesting that this same pattern persists through time. The next kind of people that would be the very first woodland people, very first people that pottery and stuff. You may have heard the name, they were called meadowwood people. That was just the name somebody gave them after a site. They're pretty interesting because, again, they follow some of these same paths. There's a large concentration of meadowwood material over in the Theresa Lakes. So they were getting around. And one of the sites I'll talk about a little more specifically is what we call the Plateau site, which is, we think, a meadowwood site, just based on a couple of things. And one of the main things that meadowwood sites are known for is they love to be liberally sprinkling things with red ochre, which is a red, naturally occurring material. This stuff here, that strangely enough is found in what we call the glacial till around here, which is actually the muck and stuff at the bottom of the glacier that was deposited. It had a lot of iron in it, and it turned into this stuff. So the Meadowood people were known for using this a lot. How much and what they used it for particularly isn't always clear, because artwork didn't necessarily survive for 3,000 years. So you can imagine that whether it was their canoes, whether it was their huts, whether it was their bodies, they probably used a lot of paint. And they had to make paint from something. So this is what they made it from. So that's one of the clues we have. And we've also found on this site, you probably can't see it from back here, but when you get a chance you can look up front. This stone here is actually an anvil. It's hard to see. This stone's a gray colored stone, but you can see some red streaking on it. Well, that red is probably 2,000 to 3,000 years old, and it's paint browned into this, because this was a surface that they were literally taking chunks of this and grinding it into a powder. So what we think the plateau site is, which is actually, strangely enough, on property we own up on House Road, not too far from the Ponderosa. It's loaded with things that tell us that these people are playing with paint. They were possibly digging it up there and processing it there. Another clue that we have that it was a Meadowood era is this point that my son found, that I stepped on several times, because it's right in the middle, I'm talking right in the middle of a tractor trailer that's been used for 100 years, that I've walked across 1,000 times, and my son found it, not me. He's got the eye. Something about taking them on sites when they're all in diapers really tuned him in. Actually, I'll have my daughter kind of take this around so people can take a look at it. It's really neat. But those are a couple of clues that have told us that that particular site's a Meadowood site, which is neat. It's always neat to find something you look for all your life, all sorts of places. You suddenly discover it's in your own backyard. Which is another point, is that in my home, which I live just north of Depauville, not too far from here on County Route 9, when I was digging dirt out of the way to make some drainage and stuff, I found stuff. I found that there was, I don't know, it was a campsite or something, but we recovered artifacts, parts of some points and some other stuff. So this stuff is everywhere. I mean, I don't believe that there's a square mile in our region that doesn't contain something somewhere. Give me enough time, I'll find it. But I'm getting old, so I won't find everything. But anyway, Meadowood was the first people that had ceramics. But I have yet to find ceramics at this particular spot, so it tells me that maybe early Meadowood, which might be the same as late archaic, they're elastic, they kind of lap, and academics get in raging debates over what this, that, and the other thing, but you get the idea. And then next, of course, you start getting into the people that made a lot of ceramics, a lot of the stuff that people are more familiar with. The next group of people that probably people might have heard of is people called the Point Peninsula people. So actually there's a whole piece of this time frame that's named after Point Peninsula over here in Shimon. And it's essentially the first people that really started using a lot of ceramics. The thinking is that they were the first people to come in contact with maize, corn, and a few other things. I don't have a lot of examples of their ceramics.
Cheese curd, did they make cheese curd?
But they foot of grindstone, again, is covered with Point Peninsula sites. People are familiar with Canoe Point. That's a famous, known pillar, or Point Peninsula site. And actually, there's almost every little point and cove on the foot of grindstone and on the head of grindstone. I've not explored the sides too much, but you can find Point Peninsula material. Potter's Beach, right next to Potter's Beach, there's a pillar or a Point Peninsula site. So they were all over the place. Now, the Bishaw site is what we call a multi-component site. It actually has different time periods on it, and we recovered a little fragments of ceramics that told us that the Point Peninsula people were monkeying around at the Bishaw site also. And also, again, in Chameau Bay was another heavy concentration. So you see this pattern kind of repeated. And then we get into the next kind of group of people that are pre-Iroquois. The last group of people that were here that before you could call them Iroquois. And we refer to them around here as the Pillar Point people because of a site in Pillar Point. Actually, and material in this shelf here is from that particular site. And it's interesting because probably during that period of time is when they had the most highly developed ceramic industry. A piece like this is very finely made. It's a lot of time spent on the decorations. It's actually got a slip on it. That's why it has a different color. It's really, they're really into the stuff when they were making it. I mean, it's really beautiful workmanship. Now the Pillar Point people are thought to have basically evolved, so to speak, into the Iroquois people. In our area, it's thought that most of the people here it was kind of like a chain going from one to the next, and that's what eventually developed the Iroquois culture. But that's a raging debate for academia. But anyway, and then of course, the last people that were here were the Iroquois people, which disappeared by about 500 years ago. And you can see that although their ceramics are pretty neat, nifty, they weren't spending as much time. They weren't, it was almost, they got more disposable or something. I'm not sure. It's just one of those quirks that nobody's able to figure out. And one of the classic attributes, fancy word, for what they call St. Lawrence Iroquois around here is they're three circles. They're called annular punctates. But this, I call it the who face, because it looks like a little who face.
Yeah.
And that's actually probably the most diagnostic attribute you can find that says, okay, that's St. Lawrence Iroquois. If you contemporary pottery from other Iroquois areas, this is not a motif they used. So that's kind of like an attribute. That's kind of like, even if you had a pile of all of it, you could pick it up and go, oh, that's St. Lawrence Iroquois. So it's pretty neat. It's the who face. I love the who face. But the thought as to why the Iroquoians basically were not here when Europeans first started coming up through here it's kind of evolving, because it's a mystery. I mean, this is the greatest place on the earth. Why would you leave, you know? But what we found is that even prior to European, there was an escalating amount of warfare between certain entities, and defining those as this tribe or that tribe is really kind of difficult based on the archaeological evidence. So it's hard to say if it was the Hurons fighting the St. Lawrence, undetermined. But there's evidence that there is increasing warfare, because the farther you get in time, or the closer to us that we get in time, you start finding that the Iroquois people moved in off the main bodies of water. They moved inland. I think there's a site inland in Grindstone you gotta help me with someday. But most of their sites are inland. And a lot of the sites in Clayton are actually, and it's called in archaeological circles, the Clayton cluster, because there's several villages, basically tied to the French Creek and its drainage. And basically, there's kind of two schools of thought. One is that it was the Five Nations people warring with these folks up here. One is that it was the Huron, which is another Iroquois people that basically lived on the other shore, think of it that way, that were but now, some of the latest thinking is that actually these people that were here may have in fact been blood relatives, so to speak, of the Five Nations groups. Specifically Onondaga and the Oneida in our area. And so, leading up to the Europeans coming in here, there was this rising tide of war, and at some point the population reached a critical mass up here where I believe they were unable to defend themselves, so to speak, from whomever was coming after them. And then we have what we call the St. Lawrence Iroquois kind of disappear from the record. Nobody kind of really knows what happened to them. I suspect that as this warfare happened, was, the first European that hit the St. Lawrence was Cartier, but he was way down in Montreal area, right? And that was in the 1500s. And I suspect that because we're on a main travel route, and the St. Lawrence Iroquois were the best water guys around, just like we all are now, right? They knew the water. I think that the speed of disease traveled quickly, so that these people were probably not only ravaged by warfare, but ravaged by disease, and it got to a critical point where they just could not defend themselves, and so I think most of them were absorbed into the Onondagas, the Oneidas. Some may have been absorbed into the Huron folks. And actually, if you ask the Onondaga or the Oneida or even the Mohawk, that's what they will tell you, is that this is their homeland. Now, it's kind of hard to demonstrate that in the archaeological record, but there's actually more evidence building that that may actually be the case. So archaeology changes a lot. But at some point, 500 years ago, the mass just, they're gone. And so therefore, the first European to come here didn't find anything but hunting grounds of the Oneida and the Onondaga. Now, anybody that's lived in Clayton is probably driven by the little sign going out towards Cape that, I'll try to pronounce it, it says Wittering Gentry. It's a little one of those little state historical signs, and it's posted there by what they thought was the site that it referred to, and that is translated, it's in Iroquois, and we're translated into Place of the Fallen Fort. And legend has it that some battle was fought there, and that was the last battle of the war. And that kind of lingered in from Native American memory into early European memory up here, because people are aware of it. That's why the name stuck. It's funny because you go anywhere in New York State and you can't pronounce the names of places unless you live there, because most of it's Native American names. I mean, Chemung, Oneida, Oswegatchie, what. But you get right to here where our little area is, where there's in fact more evidence of activity prior to 500 years ago than any place in the state. There's only 2 names that I know of, or 3 I should say, that I know of that are Native American names that refer to our area. And one of them is, you may have heard, Manitowana, which means Garden of the Great Spirit. The other one is the Place of the Fallen Fort. And the third one, as I've discovered lately, is in Chameau Bay, which brings us right back to this whole corridor connection. Something is important in the fact that the only Native American place names that survived is right here and right here. So it's pretty neat. But I'll try to give you the name of, I got it here someplace, of the Shimo Bay.
Was Bartlett's Point, Manitowoc?
Yeah, but most of those names were added by
White men?
the Gilded Age people, and my mansion's gonna be on Montauk Point.
Oh, okay.
So most of those names are actually added in later down the line. So that's what I'm saying, the only ones that remain from actually when there was Native Americans around here are these three names.
Like Calumet didn't.
No, but that figures into the Manitowoc legend, which is the Great Spirit got irritated at somebody, bundled up everything, took it with them, but a bunch of heaven spilled out into the water, and that's part of the Great Spirit. And Calumet actually figures into that because but it's unclear whether that's a historic add-on, you know, some white guy's interpretation. But anyway, the Indian name for Shimo Bay was Kahen Gaote, meaning where they smoke tobacco. Which is funny, but you know what? When you get into the Iroquois era, that was a very, very sacred, important ritual thing that took place.
The peace pipe?
The peace pipe, yeah. Let's bury the hatchet and smoke the peace pipe because we're all friends. So it's significant that that's what they called this bay. So it's telling me that we're kind of at a crossroads. People came to this is where they came to smoke their pipes, you know, and it's just very, very interesting because Iroquoian peoples, it's thought now that a lot of they're a matriarchal society. The women were in charge. It was their village, mister. And nobody else's. Now, but the men were in charge of warfare, you know, like, you know, go out and hunting and certain other duties. Politics, so to speak. Women didn't need politics, they could work it out. You know, men need politics. But anyway, but one of their rituals is thought to involve smoking pipes. And so it's thought that maybe some of what they were doing with their pipes actually was representative of their political thinking. And there's one particular thing in Jefferson County, there's all of these effigy pipes, which an effigy pipe just simply means a pipe that has a face or some kind of animal or whatever on it. And you can see this, I'm holding it closely, this pipe actually facing the smoker was a face that blew smoke out at you. It's just very cool.
Wow.
There's a head on the side, either side. This is, I believe, a lizard or a salamander representation. And you had this whole plethora, so to speak, of these effigy pipes. Here's one that's a human face. And it's interesting because they only really occur in high numbers in Jefferson County. They show up on the Five Nations sites in a brief period of time in a small, limited number. And some of the thinking now is that just as the Five Nations people have been trying to tell us for so long that some of the thinking that formed the Confederacy, the Five Nation Confederacy, may have evolved here. The politics that came up with the idea of, hey, you group, this group, we're all going to work together and we're going to take care of ourselves. That kind of thinking may in fact actually started here. And it's demonstrated by these effigy pipes. That's thought, the effigy pipes line right up time-wise with when the very, very beginnings, origins of the Five Nations were. So it's just really interesting that in fact the famous Five Nations, the League of Five Nations, the very thinking that it was all based on may have actually evolved and was born right here. I say this now because I've been reluctant to kind of say that before because I have certain bias because my grandfather insisted that Hiawatha was born here in Jefferson County and et cetera, et cetera. Well, that was kind of poo-poo for a long, long time, but now it's funny because it's come full circle And actually, this political thinking in the effigy pipes comes from an archaeologist friend of mine that basically developed this whole idea, and now it's kind of an accepted thing. And so it's kind of strange because a whole lot may have happened right here and been born here. Some of the ideas and whatnot. So it's pretty neat. It's very neat actually, if you're into this stuff, I guess. Now.
Gets me that most of these tribes were only here in the summertime, not
Nope.
during the wintertime?
Nope.
Here
That,
year
that,
round?
that is somewhat of a myth, yes. They were here year-round.
Oh, year round.
Yep. It wasn't until historic times when this was only territory claimed by the Onondaga and Oneida that it was a seasonal thing. All the other archaeological evidence shows and demonstrates that it was year-round. And that could be from sampling their trash piles, so to speak, and you can pull seeds out and different things, and these specialists can tell from a deer bone whether it was taken in the fall, the winter, all that kind of stuff. So there's definitely clear evidence that they were here year-round. And as I put it, where else would you want to be? You have to go a long way south to get through the snow belt and all that other stuff to get someplace where you could, and they didn't go to Florida. But really, this was ideal conditions up here for them in a sense. So they were basically here year round. You can see that. I mean, I'm just going to point at some of these sites and just kind of tell a little bit. This here is actually from the Matson site. This is one of the Clayton clusters. This is an Iroquois village that's up on one of the feeders for French Creek. It's pretty cool. It's actually near the place where I believe there was a famous portage from French Creek to the Chameau River. It's recorded in historical times as a well-trodden path, and it was used by Native Americans. That's one of the projects I've been monkeying with, is trying to retrace that, and we found some evidence of it and stuff. But I think that this Matson site was basically, that's what it's called, was basically right near the end of that, near County Route 9. And they basically hoofed from there over to the Chameau River. Not in Depauville, but actually west of Depauville. Because if anybody's been in Depauville and you look at the cliffs over there, think about going down those cliffs with a canoe on your back. Not really happening real good, you know. So for the portage, which means a place where you take your canoe up and you walk over and you put it back in over there. I spent a couple of years in a canoe up in Canada, and believe me, you find the path of least resistance. So we've kind of located that, and it's actually downstream from Depauville a little bit. But the Matson site is right near right near the end of that. And in this particular box over here is something a site that we basically relocated a few years ago. This is on the Chameau River, probably maybe 3 miles downstream, 4 miles downstream. And this is a multi-component site. It's got archaic stuff, it's got a little bit newer stuff, but a lot of stuff that was devoted to boat building and woodworking.
That's quartz and stuff.
This is quartz, yep. And this quartz is usually typically, and I believe there's evidence for this on this, it's not a knife, it's not a point, it's actually, again, a woodworking tool for scraping. And actually, see how it's has an asymmetrical shape? It's because it's been wore. It's a reamer. All right? Because think about bark, and the way you put bark together for a canoe is you stitch it together. So it's a lot of drilling of holes, and some holes need to be bigger and smaller. So a lot of their tools were in fact drills and reamers and things like that. There's little objects that if you're a woodworker you would know, you would look at it and go, wow, it looks like a chisel. Well, it is a chisel. But this site is only a couple of miles down the stream. And I haven't even touched on the fact that right here in Depauville, there was a large village, basically covered up by road fill now, many years ago. But it's right here at the bottom of the hill. There was a big village there, Iroquoian village. So this stuff's everywhere, everywhere. But here's another. That's a gouge. When you want to gouge some wood, can you imagine this thing comes out to a nice sharp edge? Yeah, there's a gouge for you.
Is that basalt or what is it?
I'm schist. I'm not sure. I'm unfortunately not a geologist, which I wish I was actually. And then there's a couple other sites here. Some of this material here is from Chameau Bay. There's a wood chisel, 2,000 years old, it's wood chisel. So it's, again, we still keep seeing this pattern of just people from Grindstone right to Chameau Bay. A lot of their materials match. A lot of the materials looks identical, especially in the earlier times. Some of the stuff, if I got it mixed up, I would not be able to tell them apart. And it's pretty neat because you can see kind of a corridor there. People were traveling. Maybe something was spawning one time of the year here in Chameau Bay. They all went down there and caught some fish there and did some stuff, and then, well, maybe a little later in the year they went over to the foot of the grindstone.
Different seasons, different.
Because something else was spawning. So, you know, they moved around in that corridor, but they were there all the time. They may have just had fishing camps here and there. There's what they call a fishing camp in Chameau Bay, another one. There's another Iroquoian village in Chameau Bay. But
Now that Indian mound at the foot of Grindstone, isn't that supposed to be one of the biggest ones around?
It is. I really haven't found anything definitive on it to say what it is.
Because Dick Kirk told me it's one of the biggest ones around.
Yeah, it could be. It could be. It's kind of unclear, and you basically would need to do a full-blown investigation of it. And I don't know of anybody professionally that has done that, so
Yeah,
to speak.
State isn't gonna let anybody go
Well,
there.
no, they will if you're
Qualified.
got letters by your name and stuff. You can do that kind of thing, but they probably frown on somebody like me. But
What gets me the most on the bottom of Grindstone, a guy showed me once, I won't mention any names, but he cut out a piece of sod 1 foot by 1 foot, lifted it up, and it just like a junkyard underneath there of all the Indian artifacts.
it is. There's places just absolutely insane because some of this material is hundreds, thousands of years old, and you literally, like I say, there's not a square mile around that you can't find something.
And they say the foot of the island is where you get all of this stuff because the head's been turned over so many times by the.
That's the other thing. You've had a lot more agriculture on the head of
Well,
the
the
island
winds are from
the
the west,
winds and
yeah.
so on and so forth. Of course, you know, that's another key thing. They didn't locate themselves where there was a lot of wind or et cetera like this because, you know.
I wanna know what they did for mosquitoes.
That's a good
I always wondered about
That's a
that.
good question. I mean, actually, some of the things.
Because they lived on the bottom of the island where all the mosquitoes on the top of the island doesn't have any.
And they were probably larger back then. But some of the thinking is that that they were making a grease paint that was basically a bug repellent also. There's a couple of plants that do some good to repel it, but you know, they cover themselves with bear grease or some god awful thing. I'm
But
not
to
sure,
live
but
at
they
the
were
bottom of
tough.
the island in the summertime would just be horrible.
It's yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. But
And if you don't have a screen on your tent,
you're done. You're done. Well, I don't think they had screens. I'm pretty sure. But anyway, another site that's in the Clayton cluster is what they call the St. Lawrence site, which is up Mutton Lane. It's not too far from St. Lawrence Corners. This material over here came from, there's another Iroquoian site that, although it's been pot hunted and picked over by people just looking for neat stuff, there's a lot of stuff there, a lot of material there. And it's my opinion, because of course it's academic debate, but it's my opinion that the St. Lawrence site was probably the last site, at least in our area. There may have been some later sites in the Watertown area, but as far as our little corner here, I think the St. Lawrence site was probably the last occupation in our area. And in fact, it's my thinking that when these people put the little signing plate and said Wittery Gentry, or Place of the Fallen for, it's easier for me to say. They just slapped it there because there's a site there, and, you know, all the Indians called that area, you know, Fallen Fort Place. So there's a good spot. Well, the site where that's marked near is actually way too early to be Iroquoian. So it's actually my thought that Place of the Fallen Fort is actually referring to that French Creek kind of little section in its entirety, not to one little spot on the map,
Yeah.
but just kind of referred generally. And the only specific place that I think it was actually referring to may have been the St. Lawrence site, because as we were excavating it, it had palisades around it, and it had a ditch dug around that palisade that was basically filled in with all kinds of stuff. But the entrance into the Palisades actually was a labyrinth. You had to turn this way and turn that way and this, to get inside this fortification. And the post molds, which are, when you uncover the top layer of soil and you look at the subsoil, if there was a post in it, you'll see a nice circle of dark soil. I mean, and especially in sand, which St. Lawrence site is, it really shows up nicely. Yellow sand, and here's these dark brown or black spots, and each one is where a post is. But a lot of those post molds, as we call them, when we excavated them down in cross-section, basically to see what the shape of the post was, and if it was at an angle. These are just things that archaeologists want to know, because, well, they like to know lots of sorts of stuff. But those post molds were full of charcoal that was from the posts themselves. So in other words, it very much looked like that it was burnt down. Now, it's somewhat debatable, because in the archaeological world you have to have irrefutable proof, so to speak, of what happened before you can make your pronouncement. But I don't have letters in my name, so I can pronounce things. But anyway, I believe that the place of the Fallen Fort was actually the St. Lawrence site. I think that actually whatever last battle that took place in the area actually took place there, which is kind of interesting, I think. But there's a lot of neat stuff in the St. Lawrence site. I'm probably jumping around a little bit, but to get back to this plateau site, another neat thing about it, yeah, I'm really jumping around, but is we found all kinds of slate. Now, slate objects is another diagnostic thing.
Did they trade it?
Well, it must have, because you know, there's no slate around here. It doesn't come out of the ground around here. It had to come from someplace. So they were transporting it here. And what I've discovered is that actually at this plateau site, for some reason, they were transporting it there and doing stuff with it. Exactly what, not really sure. But I don't know if you can see that this is like a big chunk of red slate. It's kind of purple looking, and the top of it has actually been ground right down, and they were whacking it, taking slices off. Now, whether to make knives, points, ornaments, kind of unclear, but they're spending a lot of time grinding slate up. I'm not sure exactly what. And I found red slate, I found green slate objects that have been ground and worked.
Green slate's in Vermont, I know.
Yeah, and then black slate. So these people are coming up to the plateau site to grind slate stuff and make paint, I guess, but it's pretty neat. But yes, you gotta pardon me if I'm jumping from time period to time period, but I'm trying to remember to tell you everything I wanted to, which I
Why
never
would they
will.
make a site so far away from water?
That's a question that remains unanswered, other than, it's,
Hunting, I'd probably say.
well, it could be hunting, and then it's hard to judge, and that'd be roughly 3,000 years ago, what the water levels were, and et cetera, is hard to estimate. And this is near, that little creek behind your folks is there, and it's, in the summertime, it dries right up. So you wouldn't think, because these people generally live near spring sources, cold water sources, things like that. And so that's why it was a very baffling place to find this stuff. And on top of that, it's all on flat limestone. Who'd have thought, I mean, it never, really? There's no pattern for these people living on flat rock, and we're all familiar with the limestone pavement around here. That's just, it looks flat and it's limestone and it goes on forever and there's no dirt. So we're not really sure why they were hanging around in that particular area, other than I suspect some of it may have been that these areas, the term for them is alvar. That's what the limestone pavement, or the Chimel barrens, that's the technical term for it. But my thinking is that a lot of these areas, which are all over the place, actually were a huge resource in terms of picture a virgin primeval forest. The canopy's way up there, trunks you can't put your arms around. Well, you go wandering around in the middle of that forest and there's really nothing there. The deer don't hang out there. You might find a squirrel, but there's not sustenance to be found as in plenty in the deep forest. So where you find things is in the edge areas, the edges of forest. That's where deer and all these other animals, that's where they hung out. Well, if you think of these alvar areas, there's a high likelihood they remain open even during when the rest of all our area here was giant forest. Just like the bare rocks you see on the islands, these flat limestone places had no trees, but they had grasslands, they had berries, bushes, brambles, rabbits, deer, all your critters would hung out in there. And I think that probably some of the reason is that they were a huge food resource. Because we tend to look at things in a Eurocentric way when, with that flat rock. What are you going to do with that? Pasture your cows on it. And hope they don't get a broken leg. So it's really marginal, useless land to us, but in fact, way back when, they actually made a huge resource. And another thing to think about too is all these little streams and streamlets we see. Each one of them more than likely would probably have a series of beaver dams built over them over time. And we had a lot of swamps. We had a lot of area that was really good for moose. In the St. Lawrence site, I don't have it with me, but I collected several moose vertebrae. So they were and actually some of the first European writings of what they saw here spoke about the abundance of bear, moose, elk, deer, you name it. It was, wow, it was all here. So it's some of it, again, this is where I get back to having to try to visualize what our land looked like over this whole time period, so that you can kind of plug in that into your mind when you're trying to concept on what were these guys doing and how were they living. Well, before you can even get started, you kind of have to get a grip on, well, what did it look like here? And that's actually one of the most difficult part for archaeologists, I think. Some of us do it obsessively, but is visualizing the landscape and then placing what we know and the people in that landscape, and then it starts to make sense. In other words, having a bunch of boat building tools wouldn't make sense if it was dry land, but it might not have been dry land. That's what the Fort Drum site is, this boat building site. It's on this chunk of gravelly sand stuff at 600 feet sea level. I mean, there's no water near it. You wouldn't think anything, but at that point in time, the water, that was a shoreline, so that's a key point for...
I have access to a photo album from 1800s on the river, and you don't recognize islands
Oh,
because
yeah.
the trees are in different places.
Oh, yeah.
And it makes the island look completely different.
It would have been unrecognizable
Yeah.
to us. It really would have. I mean, any place there was deep soil around here would have been
So 1,000
huge
years
trees.
it would have been, yeah,
Oh, yeah. And of course, like I say, the farther back you go, the more
2,000,
Changes.
3,000.
depends on, if you went back so far, it would be this way. If you went back that far, it would be this way. So and that's actually one of the hardest things for, I think, archaeologists to really do. It really is a difficult thing unless you spend mindless hours like me thinking about it. I mean, where I get back into this, it's a obsession thing, I mean, I've been unable to stop thinking about it for most of my life, but it's really, that's why I wanted to talk a little bit about that beginning tonight, because that kind of sets the stage for even trying to put any of this into sense. But the thing to remember too is all throughout the 12,000 years, these people were not too far from us because they were all boat people. They loved their boats, they lived by their boats, they traveled by their boats. If they needed to get from one body of water to the next, they carried their boat, because there's no better way to travel in a primeval forest. And we got nothing but rivers, and it's all over the place. We've got the Chameau River, St. Lawrence, of course, but then you've got the Black River, you've got the Oswegatchie River, which actually comes fairly close over in Oxbow. That's fairly close to us. And you've got the Indian River. So you've got all these river systems actually kind of cross each other, so to speak, in our area, which is another reason why a lot of the thinking is that there was really something happening here, because in a sense this was the crossroads of the world, as these people knew it. Because again, if you look at the final people that live here, the Iroquois, you'll see that their territory kind of just wrapped around the lake. Not the original territory, I want to clarify that, not what they had in colonial times, but originally the Iroquois speakers wrapped right around Lake Ontario and right up the St. Lawrence Valley, totally surrounded by Algonquin speakers. And that's how when you say Iroquois or Algonquin, referring to the language, that's just how they separate them. But and so it's interesting that these people were focused around the lake and the river, just like we are now. And whether it's the same DNA or not as the people that had the boat building site in Fort Drum that were the last people to live here, I don't know, but
Wasn't there 7 main tribes?
that is a detail lost. There's 5 original, and then they added on the Tuscarora after.
With Tuscarora, weren't they on the other side of the mountains?
Yeah, they actually came to live with the Five Nations, so to speak.
They really didn't.
Yeah, and then the other Iroquois speakers that people are familiar with are Cherokee. And some of the way they do some of the archaeological work is by tracing the language and working backwards. And so a question was, when did these people split? Because they have the same language, but they must have split apart from each other. So that, the Cherokee were in the Carolinas, Georgia, and our Iroquois were up here. So at some point in time, these people came from someplace, and it divided. And they think the division was maybe around 1,500 years ago or so, give or take. Or no, much shorter than that. No, what was it? 3,500 years ago. I'm sorry. That these people split off. So there's a lot to know, I guess. And of course I'm never going to be able to tell you everything. I'm not even sure I can tell much, but anyway, I was going to do a little Q&A here in a minute, but one of the things I did want to talk about before then was something I like to call the future of our past. Well, our past has a future, I hope. Again, it kind of falls back on, we do a great job of preserving historic buildings and celebrating this and that and all our heritage. Well, there's a huge chunk of heritage that is left by the wayside. And in fact, I couldn't tell you how many people have come up to me and go, "Oh, where can I get a book to read on this?" There's no book. There's hundreds of books that have little bits and pieces of information. Well, where can I go to see this stuff? Well, other than the stuff I have, let's see, you can go to Rochester. You can
Internet
go,
doesn't offer a lot.
well, the internet, you can find, everything's on the internet, didn't you know that? But I mean, actually interact with the stuff, go up and look at the stuff. You go to Albany, Rochester, and that's where a bulk, in places like that, or Ottawa, places like that is where the bulk of all the materials that have come from our area ended up. And unfortunately, most of it's in back rooms. It just gets lost to time. And because academics pick a subject that's important to them, and that's kind of what they do, and this wasn't important, so we're going to put that in the basement for now, or whatnot. So it's always struck me as kind of a terrible thing that there isn't a central place in our area where you can go to learn about this stuff. You can go to see this stuff, research, all that kind of thing. A place where the book would be, that would tell you what happened in these many years. And it's, you can go to, like I say, a lot of major northeastern cities, you know, like in our state, Rochester, Buffalo, Albany, Syracuse. Well, they have their museums and centers where you can go see whatever stuff they thought looked good that day, I guess, but very little about this stuff here. So, one of the things that my family, myself, and some friends of mine actually have been, well, for me it's a lifelong thing, but trying to shoot for is to remedy that somewhere down the line, whether it's sooner or later. In other words, there's this really a definite lack for a place like that around here. And so one of the things we're doing, and it's a small group of us, and actually I think maybe I'll pass around a paper, you can put your name down or whatever contact stuff if you're interested at all. But one of the things that our goal is eventually is to create a center in Thousand Islands for these materials, to learn about this stuff, to interact with this stuff. There's so much education that can be had by children. I couldn't tell you, I've had kids that are my daughter's age, my son's age. I remember when you came, because I used to go to school with my kids and show it was just, and years later they're still blown away. And so there is a real interest and there is a real need for some kind of center in our area. So like I say, a couple of us, informally, are just kind of putting together kind of a vision of what we're talking about. And hopefully, eventually, at some point in time, we can have some kind of center in the Thousand Islands where all of this stuff is and could be checked out at any time. And, you know, we have a lot of great museums and things like that around here, but it's all around 300 years or so. We got 12,000 years. And I really think that it has a place up here. And so I'm kind of putting this out there and calling it the future of the past, because it is something to think about. Because on top of that, every year another site disappears. And it's not intentional. People don't go, oh, I got an Indian site in my yard, I'm going to bulldoze it and build a house. They don't. People aren't aware. You don't know. I mean, and it's usually by chance that somebody will go, oh my gosh, what is that? Oh, geez. And it's not that somebody like me would say, no, I don't want you to put your house there. There's an Indian site there. It's just getting the opportunity to go, well, I'll tell you what, before you doze it, let us go in there and do a little salvage. And find out what's there. At least we can document it, and it's there for everybody to know and see. So there's a little of that going on too. I mean, the site where these effigy pipes here came from, it's in a place that unreal to get to. down this steep embankment, climbing over this, out, you wouldn't believe where it is. Well, I usually make it a habit of stopping by sites every so often, just drive by, see if anything's going on. And I decided I'd stop in the people's house that own this site and talk to them and maybe go down and take a look. And I knocked on the door and somebody unfamiliar answered it and they said, well, they sold it and moved. In fact, they sold it to some people that build a house down the road here. Just drive down the road, you'll find the driveway. And I'm like, oh, okay. So I drive down the road, I find their driveway, and I turn the driveway and it's going, and it's going. And it goes up this thing, and down this thing, and it turns down. I'm like, no. And sure enough, I built a house right on top of that site. And I have no idea whether they're aware or not. But there's no mechanism to tell people. You know, if you're a commercial business or a government building a road or something like that, well then you have to check with certain authorities and they'll do a survey if it's called for or stuff. But when it's just people like us, we don't know. So we're hoping to develop a mechanism maybe that'll just alert people to say, gee, I might have something, do you want to look, or anything like that. So that's a bit about the future of the past, because it is a concern for a lot of people like me, because it disappears. And while your perfect timing, I'll start the question and answer.
Oh, I just wondered if you ever thought of writing a book about all you know.
Yeah, but it would take a really long time, and I really am not. I could write about things in general terms, but again, archaeology is a science, which means there's rigorous academic standards. So if you're going to write a paper to be published, it has to have all the citations, you have to have the background, you have to be able to demonstrate your point.
No,
So-
but just you know where everything used to be 3,000 years ago. Isn't
Well,
that great?
Yeah, but again, I'd just soon have a place where you could come and find that out for yourself. A center where we could write some books, and there's actually people from all over the place that would be willing to put the stories together and information. Sure.
What was the name of the professor from Ottawa who was the
Dr. James Pendergast.
Pendergast?
He was what they call the father of St. Lawrence Iroquois archaeology. He passed away a few years ago. He was a funny guy. He looked just like an English professor, tweed jacket. But he actually coined St. Lawrence Iroquois phrase. He did a tremendous amount of work. Most of it's on the Canadian side because he was a Canadian professor. But an incredible man. He did a lot for the science. I got a chance to meet with him and go visit. Actually stayed over at his house and went to the back rooms in Ottawa Museum and saw all this stuff. Well, the Ottawa Museum didn't necessarily think that it ought to be out front, but I walked into a thing the size of a gymnasium with shelves floor to ceiling, and you push a button and the shelves slide apart, and you go in and you find the right compartment and pull out a drawer, and here's one. I'm like, it's unreal, But there again, there's another little reason why we really need some place where people can just, spend an afternoon and go check it out.
Kenny, should we pass out a sheet? People can put their names on it, and if they want to help in this project.
Sure. This is all very informal at this point, but if anybody's interested, you can put your name down, sure.
Could we have your email address?
Yes. Would you like it right now? I can tell. I even know it off the top of my head. It's one of the few things. It is KKNAPP.
Wait a minute. A pen slip. Okay,
62
okay,
at yahoo.com.
okay. Thank you.
And yes, I'm sorry, I should have put a big sign up there, because if anybody's, I'm around, so I know if anybody has any kind of questions or interest in it, that's great with me, because like I say, we're slowly trying to move kind of a process forward to get something off the ground, because really, we need need someplace around here. There's just so much here. I couldn't tell you anything in this short amount of time. I mean, just scratching the surface. I mean, I could spend 3 hours talking about one site if you want the details. So there's just so much here that we really need someplace around here where we can go together and check it out. I mean, especially kids. It really fascinating. I mean,
Document the sites and put them on YouTube.
well, yeah, I mean, we've got the information age, but I'm still a little old fashioned. I like to look at things. But, yeah, no, we're kind of trying to pull together a lot of ideas and kind of come up with some kind of thing that we can do.
Because
around
YouTube,
here.
if you get a category started, you might get other people all around that had their little bit.
I wouldn't doubt it. I mean, that's what we're trying to start, is a little snowball that gets bigger and bigger, hopefully, down the road.
Ken, I think we probably want to start a mailing list.
Sure.
People interested in our project. We'll probably want to start a website. We'll probably want to form eventually a board of directors. And we want people from all phases of life to be on this committee, on the different committees,
Yep.
for different knowledge and what have you. And like Ken said, someday we'd like to have our own building, and Ken would like it to be an independent organization. Some of these other architectural, archaeology committees and organizations have strict rules and guidelines. We want to be more or less independent if we can be.
Right. I mean, well, kind of one of the vision of it is kind of an independent group that works with SUNY, you know, as far as the educational part of it. And actually, I have a real good friend.
Work with the land trust.
The land trusts, and I have a good friend who's the archaeologist for the United Nations. So someone would involving some of the nation's folks in terms of what they have to offer people in terms of their oral histories, traditions, that kind of things that ties it all together. So it's kind of what our thinking is, pulling something together, and you know, and no doubt it won't start overnight. You know, one shovel at a time gets you a mountain someday. So that's kind of where we're at on it. So yeah, if anybody has any kind of interest in it, please feel free to get a hold of me or sign a paper or whatever you're gonna do. But it's really a fascinating subject, and I guess I never get tired of lifting up that piece of ground and finding something that's been laying there for 500 or 1,000 years. It's just like, I can't describe the thrill. I mean, it may sound goofy to a lot of normal people, but
Again.
I'm not normal. Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Just yell at me.
Hey, do you have any information about the mountains on Perch Lake?
Yeah, I do know a bit about those.
Because it's hard to find anything.
Well, you won't find only so much on them. I believe there was a short paper written by Dr. William Ritchie, who was a New York State archaeologist. You'll find some info on that. And there's some more recent work done in terms of mapping them by the Thousand Islands Archaeological Association. I don't know what they have on their site, or you might be able to contact them and find more info from them.
Do you know how old those are?
There's been a wide range of guess, but the most people that I've put faith in have said 3,000 to 5,000 years, possibly, maybe a couple thousand years old.
Because they've tied them to the ones in Ohio, right?
Not necessarily.
Or similar
The ones in Ohio are what you would call an effigy mound. In other words, they're made into a shape of an animal, or they built up for lack of a better term, a pyramid, a flat top ceremonial thing, mound like that. Now the Perch Lake mounds are absolutely unique in the sense that you looking for this mound and you find it's actually a ring of stones. It looks like a donut made out of limestone. There's a young lady in the audience that's familiar with it because on her property, there's quite a few of them, and I've had the pleasure of walking that property, and they're pretty amazing. there's been no solid evidence found. In other words, you cross-section them and you don't find anything that says, aha, this is what they are. They essentially look like a donut, a dished out area that they had a big fire in. We know that much. But what exactly they were doing, we don't know, because there's no evidence of bones or anything like that that you would find if they were roasting animals or cooking stuff. There's nothing found around them. Most of them are on the flat limestone, for whatever reason. And the latest thinking that I saw, and I can't remember where I saw it, but and something that actually rings true with me, is that they may have actually been used for food processing. There's certain plants, arrowroot's a good one. You can't pull the arrowroot tuber out and bite it, you'll be sorry. But by heating it, by roasting it, you can make it into a very good starchy edible. So there's a lot of food items that they may have been roasting. And one gal actually wrote a paper on, that's what her hypothesis is that they were basically taking these aquatic tubers, we'll call them, whether they're cattails, arrowroot, anything like that, basically layering them between material and roasting them in these big open things. And a couple of those plants still grow, a lot of them are still found in the Perch Lake area. So that's one of the triggers that led to that thinking, is because I can't remember the exact species, but there's a couple of species of plants that are known to have been used, and they're also known that they have to be processed by heat in order to make them edible. So that's one of the thinking for that, but they're generally thought to be 3,000 to 5,000 years old, which makes them pretty old. And of course they're up the Perch River. It's Perch Lake Mounds, but it's a lake they kind of made with a dam there, the DEC did, so I call it Perch River. But anyway, the Perch River is very, very unique, and it also, they may have possibly played a ceremonial role, because Perch River is a very unique river. It travels along, and then when it gets close to the lake, disappears. About 100 yards farther on, pops back up into this big round, wide bowl area that's maybe a few hundred feet across. And it doesn't connect with the lake, and you're like, what? Well, then you go a little farther, and there's the river / lake bay, and the water just comes right up out of the ground, right there at the bottom of the bay, so to speak. It's very strange. So there's a lot of thinking that would have a lot of significance, you know, as far as spiritual significance, that kind of thing. So that may have tied into what the function the Perch Lake Mounds were doing. But again, even though we have the most prehistoric archaeological activity of any area in the state, there is the least amount known about it. Nobody has a lot of definitive stuff they can say, yeah, this is what it is. And anybody that really comes along and says, well, this is how it was, and went A, B, C, D, E, I'm saying they're wrong. Because it's just, the more I learn, the less I know. I mean, the more you learn, the more questions there are. In a lot of areas in the country, for instance, for the Onondaga territory down by Syracuse, they were able to actually sequence the sites. Well, way back when, this is the group of people, and they moved from this village to this village, and then they went to this village, and then went to that village, and then they went over to this village. And they actually got dated and followed the sequence of where these people were building their villages, and they ended up here, boom, they're the Onondaga. So that, in a lot of areas, that's very doable. Our area, it's really not.
Things have probably been messed with a lot of it.
Well, a lot of things have been messed with, because back the turn of the century, not this recent one, but the one before that, it was the in thing to do to go out on a picnic and dig Indian stuff, which, you know, may be neat, but all that stuff's lost and all the information is lost, because archaeology is a destructive science. as soon as you dig it out of the ground, you've destroyed evidence. So you gotta be careful, and that's why you have to think everything through as you're doing stuff, because archaeology destroys stuff. So, but the other reason why it's very hard to get a grip up here is because there was so much going on here, so many different influences, because we're again at these crossroads of all these rivers and networks, that there was just so many influences coming from different directions and activity and this, and it's literally at this point impossible to say, well, this is where they started out, and this is where they went, and that's where they went. Not even close. A few people have attempted it, but even the attempts that have been done, they don't even come close to the mark. Because the attempts I've seen to sequence our area, they pick a handful of sites and go, that's it. Doesn't take into the fact that, well, what about the other 50 sites? You know, it's still a big unknown up here. It's still a big unknown up here, and a lot of the sites just that people don't even know where they are or what they are. Yeah, sure.
Have you found any net sinkers stones?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
In big concentrations or just here and there?
Not a big concentration. The better examples of net sinkers, when we talk about net sinkers, it would be, I don't have an example, but it would be a cobble, round or flat, and it's notched. So think of taking a round or oval shaped rock, and if you have to tie a rope around to it and you want to use it for a sinker, you would have to notch the sides or kind of peck a groove around it to hold the rope. And they are somewhat common for several different time periods. I've got a couple examples that we found. We found one down at the Bishaw site. I've found a few scattered around Grindstone, and then I've got several maybes, because when you start getting into some of this stuff, it's very difficult to discern what nature did and what man did. So a notched pebble sinker, if it's only notched on one side, you could kind of say, well, a plow had it when they were plowing the field, so that's not anything, but it actually may be. So it gets a little hazy, I guess. And some of these stuff, like some of the artifacts that we're finding from the plateau site, which involve a lot of grinding and stuff, you have to really look close, and a lot of times the magnifying glass or with a light sideways on it in order to see that one surface of it is very polished and has scarification from grinding. So some of the stuff's tricky to see, but a lot of it jumps out at you. I mean, when you see a spear point, it's like, wow. So, but no, we found net sinkers. We found pretty much almost run the gamut of artifacts. Of course, in our area, bone, wood, all that kind of stuff disappears. And the bone artifacts that you see here, most of them came from not a fire pit itself, but in soil that was full of charcoal. It changes the pH level of the soil so that in some cases it destroys, in some cases it preserves. So luckily, in a lot of cases it preserves stuff. So we've been able to pull up all kinds of stuff. I mean, right here are some examples of some bone needles and various tools. Here's a decoration. This is a bear tooth. You can't really tell, but it's been ground flat on one side, which is a very common thing here.
Oh, yeah.
Look pretty cool, huh? Dashing. But, so they were doing artwork too here. This you have to come up to look at it because it's very hard to see, but this is a rib bone of a deer, polished incredibly thin.
Wow.
Little hole drilled to hang it. It's thought that it's hung right here. And if you look very closely, it's almost like scrimshaw on there. And I tell you what, even with glasses on, I'm still going buggy-eyed looking at it, so I have no idea how they managed to do that with a rock and no glasses. I mean, it's really fine. So, and it's actually, you find that a lot in Iroquois stuff because it's actually thought that the Iroquois people spent a total of about 40 hours a week on sustenance. So the rest of the time they were playing in their boats, going to war with the other guys, or, sitting around smoking peace pipes, whatever they were doing, they had a lot of leisure time, actually. So, we even though it was a brutal time, and they had lived in brutal conditions, and Mother Nature could be just as savage as humans can be at times, but it's all the same, though. They had a 40-hour work week. That's the thinking, anyway. Nobody wrote it down, so I'm not entirely sure, but that's kind of the thinking. So it's, I wouldn't mind being an Iroquois, I guess. Mostly because I want to know where everything is. That's just me. But
I want to know what they ate.
I can tell you what they ate. A lot of fish, there's a lot of mussels, or the freshwater clams.
Which roots and which berries and which...
Pretty much the same ones you would go out and find now that you would eat. Any kind of your raspberries, your blackberries, all those types of berries that are basically a native kind of plant. That's what they were eating. They processed various nuts, acorns, beech nuts.
You found kernels of corn, right?
Yeah, and when you get into the Iroquois times, I didn't bring it with me because I couldn't remember everything, but from the St. Lawrence side, I have some examples of carbonized corn. It was corn that was tossed in the fire. It didn't burn up all the way, but the cob, parts of the cob and the kernels on it, and it's 500 or 600 years old, corn. But it's readily identifiable. I mean, it's a corn cob. So they were eating a lot of corn at that point in time. There's also thought to have eaten a lot of beans. Squash doesn't show as much in the archaeological record around here as a lot of things. The Three Sisters, corn, bean, and squash. It was the Native American Three Sisters, they call it. But there was a lot of fish.
Sunflower seeds?
Sunflower seeds, I don't know if they've been identified from here or not. They've been identified in other places, but I'm not sure, because there's really only been a couple of what you would call flora analysis, which basically they take a bunch of dirt and they sift it and they put it in water and the seeds float, even really old ones, and then they'll kind of, I'm not sure the speciality is called, but paleobotanist, I guess. Wow. Paleobotanist, and they will look at each little seed, and some of them get down and look at the pollen and identify the pollen of a particular plant. So we have really good information on their diet, for sure. And like I say, the Iroquois are out here eating a lot of corn, a lot of fish, and of course, your deer, elk, moose, bear, turtles. They ate a lot of turtles. And if you think of all the amount of snapping turtles that we have around here, and some people like turtle soup. I'm not fond of it, but that's a hearty meal that you can pick up and carry with you. There's some evidence in Eel Bay that they were staking the sturgeon. And what that means is, if you're familiar with the sturgeon, which basically isn't much around here anymore, some of these things you get hundreds of pounds. And I believe that they spawned in Eel Bay, I think, there was a lot of activity in Eel Bay anyway, but they found, years ago it was Bender, Bill, I think he told me about it, a diver.
Charlie.
Charlie, yeah, you got it, Charlie Bender. They actually found the evidence or the remains of what they would do with these sturgeon.
Weirs.
Yeah.
Fish weirs.
Well, they had fish weirs to get them to go on. Once they got them into one spot, they could take and stake them. And what that meant is take a stick, put it through the mouth, come out the gill, and just drive it in the mud. Drive it right down in there. Sturgeon is a prehistoric fish. They have a very, very low, they're cold water, they don't have much circulation. So they were literally staking this several 100-pound fish to the bottom of the water, and you know what, Marge, let's have some fish tonight. And they just dive in there and basically take their stone knife and hack off a chunk of this fish. Well, this fish could live literally, you could take 2/3 of the meat off of a sturgeon and it would still keep alive. And so they found evidence for the fish weirs and these stakes that they were using to stake these sturgeons, which is really, sounds kind of nasty, but I mean, if you didn't have a refrigerator and stuff, you know, I mean, 500-pound fish, there's, you imagine the steaks you get off of that, so, it, you know, kind of makes sense. And actually, Charlie Bender, the diver, found several pots, and whole ones of these, not broken ones, down at the bottom of the river. So it's interesting. Nobody really knows why they were there, but one of my thoughts is because they were found somewhat near some sites, is if I was on the river and it was very, very hot, and I want a nice cold drink of water, well, the surface temperature when it gets to be 70 degrees, that ain't so refreshing, but if you had a bucket that was weighted, like one of these things would be, that sank way down in about 30 feet of water, and you pull that baby up fast, it's going to be full of some really nice cold water. Or you would actually be able to store perishables in that by dropping it down in the cold water. So I'm thinking that's some of the reason why they found some intact and broken pieces out in the water. And not during a time period when the water was way down. During the time period when the water was about where it is now. So it's pretty neat, actually. So they were very inventive, to say the least, very inventive. But it's a subject that I love. What can I say? Got a few more minutes. If anybody's got more questions or you want me to carry on, I'll. Yes.
How far up into Canada did the Iroquois tribes go?
Not too far away from the St. Lawrence. In other words, the shores of Lake Ontario, the north shores, and the call it the north shore of the St. Lawrence, not too far away from there. You know, a little ways up some of the inland rivers, but later, as you get into the European times, then they were kind of all over the place.
Right.
But originally, you could almost draw a swath right around Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River up to Montreal. And a zone not too far away from those two bodies of waters is basically the territory, the original territory of the Iroquois speakers. Because they were surrounded by Algonquin speakers. So, which I'm suspecting that was the biggest people that they were having a war with was probably Algonquin speakers. They would have had the most issues with each other, I guess, I'm not sure. But, yeah, no, the Iroquois are pretty refined to the water. So, they were boat people like us, I believe. And I tend to believe that the ones that lived right in our area were the best boat people out of all the Iroquois speakers. Because we're naturally the best boaters, or we like to think of ourselves. But I think there is some actually valid evidence for that, because if you think about it, they would have been day in and day out in a boat. You know, they wouldn't have thought much about sending out the 10-year-old kid in a canoe to go fishing for the day, you know, or whatever. People would have grown up in boats, kind of like if you've grown up around here, you grew up in a boat more or less. Versus some other tribes that, Iroquois tribes that, say any one of the 5 nations, they were kind of focused around a Onondaga Lake or Oneida Lake and the shores of Lake Ontario, but not their villages and their habitation zones didn't revolve strictly around these bodies of water like they do up here. And of course, up here, you can't walk south, north, east, or west without coming across a river, a large stream, a lake. You just can't do it. To where a lot of the other areas, when you get off Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence, the rivers and feeders are far and few between, and that's kind of what you focused around. But up here, I mean, geez, yeah, Chevaux River takes you to the lake, go over that way a little way, French Creek takes you to the river. You can go that way and hit the Black River, which is a pathway to go way up into the Tug Hill. Because generally they follow waterways as their roads. There's travel paths that get you to the Oswegatchie over in Oxbow. That would take you up to Ogdensburg. The Indian River, you can get into the Black Lake system. So all these are major travel ways. So again, that's some of the reason why our area's got so much in it, but it's so confusing in terms of an archaeologist, because there was just so much going on, and I think there were so many influences and stuff coming from different directions, and it was the end place to be in my mind.
You think with the waterway we'd be so connected because of the lakes and.
Yeah, I mean, think of the St. Lawrence as the Route 81 of the time. And that's kind of, in other words, when we think about a map, we think of longitude, latitude, this kind of things, and roads and stuff. Their map was defined by waterways. Their longitude and latitude was a creek, a river, this landmark, that landmark. So they saw things, they still saw sunrises in the east and sets in the west and that kind of thing. And they were very star conscious. Some of the major events during the course of the year, major ceremonial events, still today are based around the rise of certain particular stars in the sky. In fact, on Fort Drum, maybe 10 or longer now ago, they discovered the only what we call monolithic stonework for Native Americans in the area. In other words, these guys here didn't build stone houses. They didn't do things with stone. They weren't like Aztecs, but there's a site on Fort Drum. It's called the Calendar Site, and it's basically an observatory. And of course, I got all excited. I got the chance to see it. I go there, I go up the middle of this big open sandy area, and here's this pile of boulders, and I'm looking around. I don't know what I was expecting, a giant sundial or something. Anyway, and here it is, and I'm like, huh? And it just looked like haphazard boulders kind of there, but then once I saw the plan and the layout and where they've discovered post holes and everything else, it's actually an observatory for observing the rise of the dog star Sirius, the solstices, and the rise of one other star, I can't recall, but it's pretty neat. It's like, wow. So, which made me, of course, rethink all of those piles of boulders I've seen in all my travels, and I'm thinking, whoa, you gotta be kidding me. So, now everything's suspect to me. It's the same thing with the boat building site at Fort Drum there. I finally saw what they were talking, oh yeah, we found these tools, and I finally saw them, I look at them, well, and they basically look like a triangulated piece of quartz that you knocked off a rock. I looked at them and I go, oh my God, are you kidding me? So now, and I'm thinking of all the things I just, that's nothing. But, so now I'm having to relook at a lot of things, and so again, you're learning something new all the time. That's what's neat about it, is a year from now, I'll probably be wrong about something. Although I'm probably wrong about something anyway, but I mean, it works that way.
You need a time machine.
You know what? I really, really like that. I would like a time machine.
Thanks, Kenny.
You're welcome.
Think about.
Yes.
I learned a lot.